supposed to be free and independent, Mr. Ban Ki-moon. Supposed to be free, the 54 countries. We come to the United Nations, it's ceremonial. Every year, September, we are there. We pay lots of money to go there. And to the General Assembly, we make speeches, we go back home, year in, year out. But the bosses in the Security Council say, you shall never have the powers that we have as permanent members. And we have asked and asked and asked. And asked and asked. Reform the Security Council.
What you just heard was Robert Mugabe, former president of Zimbabwe, speaking at the 26th African Union Summit in Addis Ababa in 2016 on UN Security Council reform. Have you ever noticed during the United Nations General Assembly how the room looks different depending on who's speaking? When heads of states from wealthy or powerful countries address the assembly, the room is packed, cameras flashing, delegates listening, translators working overtime. But when it's time for African leaders to speak, the room is practically empty. And that silence says a lot. Welcome to the Africa Briefing Room, where we unpack the events and headlines shaping the continent. In this briefing, we explore why Africa's calls for reform at the UN have echoed for decades unanswered, and why this very system was never made for Africa. The birth of a club. The United Nations was created in 1945, in the aftermath of World War II. Back then, almost the entire African continent was still under colonial rule. Only 4 African countries, Egypt, Liberia, Ethiopia, and South Africa, were present among the original founding members. Egypt was recognized as an independent kingdom, although Britain retained major influence over its affairs. Liberia, founded by freed African Americans, had maintained its independence since the 19th century. South Africa, a self-governing British dominion, was represented internationally by its white minority government. Ethiopia, one of the few African nations to resist long-term colonization, regained its sovereignty after Italian occupation in 1941 and signed the UN Charter as a founding member in June 1945. Today, African countries account for more than a quarter of the General Assembly, yet the Security Council's permanent seats and veto power remain exclusively held by the United States, United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia. The calls for reform. For decades, African leaders have stood before the gold backdrop of the General Assembly, delivering speeches that sound eerily familiar year after year. We call for a fairer, more inclusive international order. We want reform of the Security Council to reflect today's realities. Africa deserves a permanent seat. From Kwame Nkrumah to Julius Nyerere, from Thabo Mbeki to today's presidents, the messages stayed the same, and the response has been polite applause, followed by inaction. Because reforming the UN means changing who holds power, and the Permanent Five have no incentive to share it. A system that never evolved. Calls for structural change, like expanding the Security Council or revisiting the veto power, are routinely postponed, met with resistance, or sidelined without substitutive action. In 2005, the Isolini Consensus, adopted by the African Union, clearly outlined Africa's position: at least 2 permanent seats with veto power and 5 non-permanent seats. In recent years, Africa has held 3 of the 10 non-permanent Security Council seats through rotation. The call for permanent seats remains unmet 20 years later. An entire generation has grown up hearing the same promises, seeing the same diplomatic theater, watching the same proposal gather dust in UN committee rooms. Meanwhile, the last adjustment to permanent Security Council membership was over half a century ago, when China joined the Permanent Five in 1971. Yet Africa makes up a large share of the Council's agenda. In 2018, about 50% of Security Council meetings and nearly 70% of its resolutions focused on African peace and security issues. By 2023, Africa still accounted for 38% of meetings and 51% of resolutions. The contradiction is clear. A continent that dominates the Council's agenda remains excluded from its decisions. Follow the money. How UN funding shapes power. Africa's diminished voice at the United Nations is also a matter of finances. The UN operates on assessed contributions, meaning each country pays a share based on its national income. The richer the country, the more it pays. Today, the United States, China, Japan, Germany, and France are the UN's largest funders. Together, they cover nearly half of the UN's regular budget, and even more when it comes to peacekeeping and specialized agencies. In stark contrast, African nations collectively provide less than 3% of the regular budget, even while constituting more than a quarter of the world's member states. This imbalance quietly shapes influence. Major donors have more sway in decision-making, often steering priorities and agendas toward their interests. Leadership role within UN agencies similarly tend to favor citizens from these donor countries. Africa's contributions go far beyond money. It provides peacekeepers and hosts major humanitarian operations, amongst other things. In the end, reforming the UN isn't just about fairness. It's about who holds the financial power. The peacekeeping paradox. Africa's invisible influence is most visible in UN peacekeeping. As of mid-2024, African nations made up about 44% of all UN peacekeepers. Major contributors included Ethiopia, Rwanda, Ghana, Senegal, and Kenya, each providing thousands of personnel. African troops serve in some of the world's toughest crisis zones, and often bear the burden when missions fail. In 1993, the shadow of failure in Somalia loomed large over the international community. The deaths of US soldiers in Mogadishu had made world powers reluctant to intervene anywhere in Africa again. So when genocide erupted in Rwanda a year later, the United Nations chose caution over action. On the ground, Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, commander of the UN peacekeeping mission, sent desperate cables warning that mass killings were imminent. As the violence intensified, he pleaded for reinforcements. Instead, the Security Council voted to cut his force from 2,500 troops to just 270, right as the genocide began. His warnings went unanswered, and by the time the world responded, it was too late. Yet over the years, African nations have stood at the front lines of peacekeeping. Ethiopian troops have long served under the UN in Abyei, a disputed border region between Sudan and South Sudan, as well as in South Sudan itself, helping to stabilize one of the continent's most volatile frontiers. Ghana and Kenya also remain central to the United Nations mission in South Sudan, protecting civilians, enabling humanitarian aid, and supporting fragile peace processes. In 2024, Kenya led a multinational peacekeeping mission to Haiti, deploying over 700 police officers as part of a UN-backed response to the ongoing security crisis. These are just a few examples that show how Africa continues to carry global responsibilities, even when the world's attention fades, yet remains excluded from the rooms where peacekeeping mandates are written. The climate injustice. Africa's outsized vulnerability to climate change, despite its minimal contribution to the global crisis, has become one of the starkest examples of international injustice and marginalization. African leaders and UN officials alike have called attention to this divide, pointing out that Africa produces only about 3% of total global greenhouse gas emissions, yet faces some of the greatest climate risks anywhere on the planet. By 2050, Africans will make up 1 in 4 people globally, yet the continent remains the most exposed to climate threats, largely caused by richer nations. Droughts, floods, and crop failures threaten more than half of sub-Saharan Africans, who depend on rain-fed agriculture. The numbers are stark. Recent global climate risk indexes identify that 17 of the 20 countries most threatened by climate change are in Africa. Today, around 250 million Africans face high water stress today, with projections reaching 700 million by 2030, as rising temperatures and erratic weather accelerate. And yet, Africa receives only 3.8% of global climate research funding, most of which goes to institutions outside the continent. As a result, the people bearing the brunt of climate change are left out of the solutions, left largely dependent on decisions made and resources allocated by those least affected by the climate crisis. Why this matters? When African leaders address the assembly, the empty room speaks volumes. It reflects a system where African agency is undervalued. By 2050, Africa will have the world's youngest population, a median age of 19, compared to Europe's 40+, along with the fastest growing economies and the largest share of the future global workforce. Yet the UN remains anchored to a power structure built 80 years ago. If the UN stays stuck in the past, frozen in a 1945 mindset, while Africa transforms into the world's largest demographic and economic force, institution risks becoming out of touch with the world it claims to serve. A pragmatic path forward. The UN offers global legitimacy, shaping global narratives and decisions. But legitimacy in this system comes at a price, mainly financial. With African nations together contributing less than 3% of the UN's budget, expecting radical reform or a genuine power shift is unrealistic. The UN General Assembly remains useful for diplomacy and outreach with diasporas, but real transformation, such as the vision set out in the Esselwini Consensus by the African Union, has not moved beyond rhetoric. A pragmatic path lies in investing energy in forums like BRICS, which now represent the majority of the world's population, and prioritize South-South cooperation. BRICS institutions like the New Development Bank have already financed major infrastructure projects across Africa, often without the strict political conditions attached to Western assistance. However, BRICS is not without its critics, especially in the West. Concerns are often raised about internal divisions, China's influential role, and the inclusion of countries like Iran. Critics argue that Iran's membership, given its regional conflicts and global tensions with the US and Europe, complicates BRICS's effectiveness and risks friction with Western institutions. But it's worth considering whether Iran is being singled out largely because it challenges Western interests. Proxy conflicts are not unique to Iran. The United States and other major powers have long engaged in similar actions worldwide. Such criticisms reflect a do as I say, not as I do double standard, where behavior is condemned in rivals but tolerated or justified in allies. For Africa, the headline rivalries matter less than the practical impacts. Access to resources, investment, and leverage to advance African priorities. The focus on Iran's reputation often distracts from a broader truth. Every major power has a complex history. African countries are seeking tangible results and opportunities to shape global agendas, not lectures or gatekeeping about who deserves a voice. In closing, next year, when you see that enormous gold-paneled hall with rows of empty seats, as an African leader addresses the General Assembly, remember, this isn't just about indifference. It reflects how the voices and struggles of the continent are often undervalued, overlooked, or deprioritized within the global community. And until that changes, those speeches, full of vision, full of truth, will continue to echo in an empty room.